first we want to talk about cell theory, and this is very, very important to biology, very fundamental, but it's actually so fundamental that probably many of you already know what it is without even ever hearing about it, probably. So what is the cell theory? It basically says that cells are the basic unit of all living organisms. All living organisms are made up of cells, and cells can only be made from other cells. The hereditary information or the genetic information is thus passed from one cell to another. Essentially, what this is saying is that everything that's alive is made of cells, and cells, the only way to make more cells is to have an existing cell that makes a new one, essentially. Okay, I'm sure many of you have already knew that, even if you didn't know that was the cell theory. But yeah, okay. As we talked about in our previous lecture, genetic information is always stored in the cells, which act essentially as the blueprint for the cell's function. And you can see here a cross-section of an animal cell, and the genetic information in an animal cell is always located here in the middle of the nucleus. We'll talk about later today, actually, that's not always the case for all cells, that some of them don't even have a nucleus, but they all have some DNA or some kind of genetic information. Whether it be DNA, some have RNA, but they always have some kind of genetic information stored in them. When a cell matures, it undergoes a process called mitosis in eukaryotes, and we'll talk about a little bit more for prokaryotes, in which the cell splits apart and creates a daughter cell, which should be, in most cases, an exact copy of itself. It's called a daughter cell because it essentially birthing a new cell, and that's how cells are created. And this is also how cells pass genetic information from one to another. Like I said, it should most of the time be an exact genetic copy of the parent. That's not always the case because mistakes do happen. It's not a perfect system, but usually the idea is that it should be a mostly exact copy of the parent, and that's how you get genetic information from one generation of cells to another. Okay. Cell types. So there are two main cell types, prokaryotes and eukaryotes. Eukaryotes are far more complex, and you probably spend most of your studying and your college and high school career learning about eukaryotes, because one, they are more complicated, and two, most of the stuff that we deal with in biology, like humans, animals, plants, those are all eukaryotes. They're not prokaryotes. Prokaryote cells are much simpler, and they're found essentially only in bacteria, or we'll talk about archaea or prokaryotes as well. Okay, probably many of you haven't really, unless you've taken like a microbiology course or something like that, many of you haven't really learned too much about bacteria, and you've mostly been focusing your biology studies on animals, plants, maybe. Okay. And this, hopefully some of you remember, is called a phylogenetic tree. I'll just write it here, philo and genetic tree. Okay. This essentially shows kind of the progress of, I guess, evolution. So this was the starting point of, I guess, all life, since this is talking about bacteria and eukaryotic cells. So this is the starting point of all life, and then it branched out into two different things. And this branch is known as bacteria. And there's just many, many, many different types of bacteria you can see here that kind of like branched off this main line into specific subsets. Then in this branch, right, which eventually became known as eukaryotes, there was another split right here, another branch point called archaea. These are essentially like the precursors, I guess, or they're very similar to bacteria, but different enough from bacteria that they aren't classified as bacteria. And actually, I've heard that they are equally different from bacteria as they are from eukaryotes. They're kind of like, I guess, a different branch, right? Even though they look kind of similar to bacteria and a lot of their characteristics are similar, they're still very different and distinct from bacteria. Okay. And then at this branch point, you had the archaea, and you also had these eukaryotes, which became plants, fungus, animals, molds, and all of these other things, right? And this is where we would fall in, right, in this branch line, right? And this is obviously going from, clear this. This is obviously going from bottom to top in terms of time. So this was at like the beginning of life, and this is kind of the now, right, or something like that. And it goes up. As to prokaryotes versus eukaryotes, these are all prokaryotes. So archaea and bacteria are all prokaryotic, meaning that they, well, actually, we'll talk about the differences in a bit, but just remember that these are prokaryotes and these are eukaryotes. The only eukaryotes are these, okay? So you can see like the majority of the majority of life is prokaryotic, and it's much simpler, but we also have obviously only eukaryotes, okay? But remember that bacteria and archaea, even though they're both prokaryotes, they actually are very distinct, even though they do have similarities, okay?